November 1984. Captain Second-Rank Dmitry Volkov brought his Victor III class submarine to periscope depth 70 kilometers off the Aleutian Islands, exactly where Soviet naval intelligence said he'd be safe. The Pacific stretched empty in every direction. No American destroyers, no patrol aircraft, just open water and the mission. Slip through the Guyuk Gap monitoring stations and prove the new anechoic coding worked. Volkov had every reason for confidence. His submarine wore the latest sound-dampening tiles, rubber compounds embedded with thousands of tiny voids that swallowed sonar pings like a sponge drinks water. Moscow's acoustic engineers promised these tiles made the Victor III quieter than anything America could hear. The boat had cost 150 million rubles. The coating alone added another 12 million. 20 minutes into the transit, his sonar officer reported something wrong. "Captain, I have a surface contact. Bearing 270, range approximately 15,000 meters. Volkov checked the tactical display. One surface vessel, moving slowly. No active sonar. No helicopters. The signature didn't match any warship in the recognition manual. Classification? Unknown, sir. Civilian displacement. Maybe 8,000 tons. She's just sitting there. Soviet doctrine was clear. When detected, dive deep and run silent. But Volkov hadn't been detected. The American ship wasn't pinging, wasn't maneuvering. His orders said maintain course unless directly threatened. He held depth and watched. The American vessel shadowed him for 6 hours. She never came closer, never activated search radar, never launched a helicopter. She just followed, maintaining perfect distance, matching every course change Volkov made. When he finally dove to 400 meters and ran southwest at 18 knots, she stayed on the surface, tracking him like she could see through 1,000 feet of seawater. Volkov surfaced after midnight and transmitted an encrypted burst to Pacific Fleet headquarters. Contact with unknown American surveillance vessel. Believe mission compromise. Request instructions. The response came 16 hours later, after his message had climbed through 4 levels of naval command and landed on a desk in Moscow, where analysts were assembling a disturbing pattern. Volkov's Victor III was the 11th Soviet submarine to report the same phantom tracking in 60 days. Same profile, same impossible precision, same bloodhound patience. The Americans had built something new, something that didn't hunt submarines with active sonar or depth charges, something that just listened, heard everything, and never let go. The ship carried no visible weapons. Her crew wore civilian clothes. According to reconnaissance photos, she didn't even have a proper military designation, just USNS painted on her hull instead of USS. Soviet naval intelligence gave her a code name, Sudno Prizrak, ghost ship. What they didn't know, what would take Moscow's best minds 3 more years to piece together, was that this unarmed civilian vessel and her 5 sister ships had already made the entire Soviet submarine fleet obsolete. Not through firepower, through something far more devastating, perfect awareness. The Americans had stopped trying to kill submarines. They'd figured out how to hear them from half an ocean away, track every movement, and know exactly where every Russian boat was, every minute of every day. The Cold War's deadliest weapon didn't fire a shot. It just listened. The pattern emerged in early 1985 when Soviet naval intelligence compiled contact reports from 16 submarines across 3 fleets. Every boat, from the Northern Fleet's Akula-class hunters to the Pacific Fleet's aging November-class boomers, reported the same experience. They'd execute textbook evasion protocols, deploy every countermeasure in the manual, and still American forces would be waiting at the next waypoint. Captain First Rank Yevgeny Chernov experienced it firsthand in February. His Delta V ballistic missile submarine departed the Kola Peninsula under polar ice, following a route planned 3 months in advance by the General Staff. The path took him through deep Arctic basins where thermoclines should have hidden his acoustic signature. Soviet doctrine called these waters acoustically opaque, basically invisible to Western sonar. American P-3 Orion patrol aircraft dropped sonobuoys directly over his position 6 hours into the mission. Chernov dove to 600 meters. The Orion stayed overhead. He cut speed to 4 knots, barely moving. They adjusted their patrol pattern to match. When he finally surfaced 72 hours later, exhausted and low on battery power, a Knox-class frigate was waiting 8 kilometers away. The Americans weren't guessing. They knew. Moscow's response was bureaucratic panic. The main intelligence directorate, GRU, launched an investigation assuming a mole had compromised submarine routing schedules. They arrested 12 naval officers, interrogated 47 more, and found nothing. The KGB reviewed communication protocols, checked for cipher machine compromises, even examined whether American satellites could somehow detect submarine wakes from orbit. Every theory hit the same wall. The detections were too precise, too consistent, too fast. Satellites couldn't see through water. Radio intercepts couldn't explain how Americans track submarines maintaining complete radio silence. Human intelligence couldn't account for real-time tracking across thousands of square kilometers of open ocean. Captain Second Rank Igor Kuroyedov, assigned to Naval Intelligence's Technical Analysis Section, proposed the unthinkable in a classified report dated March 1985. American passive sonar capability exceeds theoretical models by minimum factor of 10. Recommend immediate acoustic signature reduction program and assumption all Soviet submarines are continuously monitored when outside territorial waters. His superiors rejected the assessment as defeatist. Soviet acousticians had calculated that detecting a submarine beyond 30 kilometers required active sonar, loud pinging that revealed the hunter's position. America's sosus fixed arrays could hear farther, maybe 60 kilometers under perfect conditions, but they were stationary installations, easy to map, easy to avoid. Kuroyedov's report included one detail his commanders ignored. 6 separate submarine encounters mentioned the same slow-moving civilian ship. She appeared in the Barents Sea in January, the Sea of Okhotsk in February, and off Petropavlovsk in March. Never closer than 15 kilometers. Never using active sonar. Never armed. The ship's designation kept appearing in reconnaissance photographs. USNS Impeccable, ocean surveillance vessel, crew of 25 civilians, 5 military technicians, displacement 8 to 125 tons, top speed 13 knots, built 1985 at a shipyard in Tacoma, Washington, for $135 million. What Kuroyedov couldn't know, what wouldn't become clear until a GRU technical officer examined unclassified American naval journals in 1987, was that Impeccable wasn't hunting submarines. She was the hub of an acoustic surveillance network that had turned the entire Pacific Ocean into a listening room. The ship didn't need to get close. She was already hearing everything from hundreds of kilometers away, processing sounds Soviet engineers thought were impossible to detect. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In April 1985, a Soviet trawler operating near the Aleutians recovered a section of cable floating on the surface. 70 meters of black rubber housing, waterlogged and damaged, but intact enough for analysis. Naval intelligence flew it to the Central Research Institute of Materials in Leningrad within 48 hours. Senior engineer Anatoly Petrov spent 3 weeks dissecting it. The cable contained 128 hydrophones spaced at precise intervals, each connected through shielded wiring to signal processing nodes. The hydrophones themselves used piezoelectric ceramic elements with frequency response curves spanning 5 Hz to 50 kHz. American manufacturing stamps dated the components to 1983. The entire assembly was designed to be towed behind a ship at depths up to 500 meters. Petrov ran the numbers and felt his stomach drop. A towed array this long could detect acoustic signatures across a horizontal range exceeding 200 kilometers under optimal propagation conditions. The Americans weren't using fixed sosus stations. They'd made the listening posts mobile. He submitted his report with a single-line conclusion: Soviet submarine acoustic stealth doctrine is obsolete. The problem was physics. Soviet submarines had gotten quieter. The new Acoustic-class boats measured around 110 decibels at tactical speeds, down from 150 decibels on older November-class boats. Soviet engineers celebrated this as a triumph. They'd reduced radiated noise by a factor of 40. But American hydrophone technology had improved by a factor of 200. The gap came down to manufacturing precision. Soviet sonar systems used components built to tolerances of 1 millimeter, acceptable for most military applications, deadly inadequate for passive acoustic detection. The American hydrophones Petrov examined showed tolerances of 0.01 millimeters, 2 orders of magnitude tighter. That precision meant they could isolate individual frequency bands, filter out ocean ambient noise, and detect the specific mechanical signatures of submarine machinery. Every Soviet submarine leaked sound. Coolant pumps hummed at characteristic frequencies. Reduction gears created harmonic patterns. Propeller blades generated cavitation noise, tiny bubbles forming and collapsing in turbulent water. Soviet engineers knew about these sources but considered them unavoidable below certain thresholds. They'd optimized submarines to be quieter than the ocean itself at ranges beyond 30 kilometers. The Americans had learned to hear whispers in a hurricane. Petrov's team built acoustic models using the recovered array specifications. They tested them against recorded signatures from Soviet submarines. The results were catastrophic. An Akula-class boat running at 12 knots could be detected at ranges up to 180 kilometers in deep water. A Delta IV launching ballistic missiles, its pumps running at full power, would be audible from 300 kilometers away. The new titanium-hulled Sierra-class boats, which cost 400 million rubles each specifically for acoustic stealth, showed up just as clearly. The Soviet Navy had spent 2 decades and 60 billion rubles building submarines that hid from sonar technology America had abandoned in 1980. Admiral Chernovin, Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet Navy, read Petrov's report in May 1985 and immediately classified it above top secret. He restricted distribution to 11 people. The implications were too devastating for general circulation. Every Soviet ballistic missile submarine could be tracked from the moment it left port. Every attack submarine could be monitored during its entire patrol. The cornerstone of Soviet naval strategy, submarines as invisible retaliatory weapons, had become a fiction. And somewhere in the Pacific, USNS Impeccable was still listening. The ship that would end Soviet submarine secrecy began as a budget crisis compromise in 1979. Secretary of the Navy R. James Woolsey faced a nightmare. Sosus fixed arrays covered the Atlantic but left massive gaps in the Pacific. Installing enough seabed hydrophones to monitor Soviet activity from Vladivostok to the Bering Strait would cost $4.2 billion and take 12 years. The Navy had 18 months and $180 million. Dr. Robert Frosch, Assistant Secretary for Research and Development, proposed something radical during a Pentagon meeting in November 1979. Stop building listening posts, build ships that listen. The concept wasn't new. The Navy had experimented with towed sonar arrays since the 1960s, dragging hydrophone cables behind destroyers and frigates. But warships made terrible surveillance platforms. They were loud. Their engines, generators, and pumps created acoustic noise that drowned out distant contacts. They were expensive to operate, costing $40,000 per day in fuel and crew. And they had missions that took them away from monitoring stations. Frosch wanted something different. A civilian ship. Slow. Quiet. Capable of staying on station for 60 days without refueling. Crewed by merchant mariners who cost 1/3 what Navy personnel cost. The ship wouldn't hunt submarines. It would just listen and relay data to command centers ashore via satellite. The proposal landed on the desk of Thomas B. Hayward, Chief of Naval Operations, who saw past the budget appeal to the strategic revolution underneath. A mobile listening platform could reposition in days, covering areas where Soviet submarines thought they were safe. It could operate in international waters without diplomatic complications. And unlike fixed arrays that could be mapped and avoided, a surveillance ship could change patrol routes, creating acoustic coverage where Moscow least expected it. Hayward approved the concept in January 1980 with one critical addition. The ship would deploy SURTASS, Surveillance Towed Array Sensor System, a technology so classified that even the name was compartmentalized until 1982. The contract went to Tacoma Boat Building Company in Washington State. Lead naval architect James Morrison received specifications unlike anything he'd worked on. The ship needed a displacement of 8,000 tons, but a draft shallow enough for literal operations. Twin diesel-electric engines producing 3,200 horsepower total, enough for 13 knots maximum, but optimized for 5-knot loitering. Acoustic quieting requirements that exceeded those for attack submarines. Morrison's team designed the hull around silence. The engine sat on pneumatic isolation mounts that absorbed 98% of vibration before it reached the hull. Propellers used a 5-blade configuration with scimitar-shaped blades to minimize cavitation. Even the air conditioning system got redesigned. Standard compressors created too much noise, so Morrison specified magnetic bearing units that operated with zero mechanical contact. The keel for USNS Impeccable, TAGOS-5, was laid in September 1983. She slid down the waves 14 months later, a stubby vessel with a rounded bow, massive stern handling gear, and sensor arrays were 3 times what the hull cost. No weapons, no armor, no military crew except 5 Navy technicians who operated the SURTASS equipment. She looked like a floating research station. The Soviets would classify her as an auxiliary vessel, non-threatening, low-priority surveillance target. That was exactly the point. Impeccable wasn't designed to look dangerous. She was designed to hear a submarine captain's career end from 200 kilometers away, while he still thought he was hidden. First deployment, March 1985. Patrol area, Sea of Okhotsk, where Soviet ballistic missile submarines conducted deterrent patrols Moscow considered undetectable. The technology that made Impeccable lethal started in a Bell Laboratories acoustics research facility in Murray Hill, New Jersey, where physicist Dr. Harold Saxton was trying to solve a problem that had nothing to do with submarines. In 1976, Saxton's team was developing underwater communication systems for offshore oil platforms. They needed hydrophones sensitive enough to detect acoustic signals through hundreds of meters of noisy ocean without picking up interference from surface waves, marine life, or drilling equipment. Saxton's solution was elegant. Instead of one hydrophone, use hundreds arranged in a precise linear array. Each hydrophone would capture slightly different arrival times for the same sound wave. Process those time differences through phased array algorithms, and you could identify the exact direction and distance of the source. More importantly, you could filter out everything else. The Navy's Office of Naval Research saw the civilian project in a 1977 technical journal and immediately classified the underlying mathematics. Within 6 months, Saxton was working on a black program at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., with a new objective: detect Soviet submarines at ranges previously considered impossible. The challenge was computational. A towed array with 128 hydrophones generated 128 simultaneous data streams, each sampling acoustic pressure 10,000 times per second. That meant 1.28 million data points per second that needed real-time processing to extract useful signals from ocean noise. In 1977, no shipboard computer could handle that load. Westinghouse Electric won the signal processing contract in early 1978. Lead engineer Dr. Catherine Lin assembled a team that built custom integrated circuits specifically for fast Fourier transform calculations, mathematical operations that converted time-domain acoustic signals into frequency-domain signatures. The circuits used gallium arsenide semiconductors instead of silicon, running at clock speeds of 200 MHz when commercial processors topped out at 8 MHz. Lin's processors could analyze incoming hydrophone data in 0.4 seconds, fast enough to track moving contacts in real time. But the real innovation was pattern recognition software that Dr. Michael Orr developed at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. Orr's algorithms didn't just detect sounds, they identified them. Every submarine had an acoustic fingerprint. A Soviet Victor III's main coolant pumps operated at 3600 RPM, creating a fundamental frequency of 60 Hz plus harmonics at 120, 180, and 240 Hz. The reduction gear between the steam turbine and propeller shaft generated a distinctive whine at 428 Hz. Even the electrical generators had characteristic hum patterns. Orr's software learned these signatures, stored them in a database, and could identify not just submarine class, but individual boats based on unique mechanical irregularities. The complete SURTASS system weighed 46 tons. The towed array itself stretched 2,600 meters, longer than 2 aircraft carriers placed end to end. Deploying it required a stern handling system with dual hydraulic winches rated for 80,000 pounds of tension. Once deployed, the array streamed behind Impeccable at depths between 150 and 500 meters, below the thermal layers where temperature gradients bent sound waves. At 5 knots, Impeccable's optimal listening speed, the array maintained perfect stability. The hydrophones picked up sounds across a frequency range from 5 Hz to 2,500 Hz, covering everything from whale songs to propeller cavitation. The phased array processing gave bearing accuracy within 0.5 degrees. Range estimation used multipath propagation analysis, measuring how sound waves bounced off the ocean floor and surface before reaching the array. Effective detection range in deep Pacific water: 185 kilometers for submarines running tactical speeds, up to 240 kilometers for boats at flank speed. The Soviets were still operating under the assumption that nothing could hear them beyond 30 kilometers. Impeccable's first operational patrol began on March 12, 1985, departing Naval Base Kitsap with orders to establish a surveillance box in the Sea of Okhotsk, water the Soviet Pacific Fleet considered a private lake. The civilian crew had no idea what they were about to accomplish. Captain Michael Harrington, a 52-year-old merchant mariner, had spent 30 years hauling cargo. Now he commanded the most sophisticated listening platform ever deployed. The first contact came 18 hours after reaching station. Petty Officer Sarah Chen was on watch in the SURTASS Operations Center when her display lit up with a low-frequency tonal at bearing 047 degrees, range 164 kilometers. The signature database identified it immediately. Delta III class ballistic missile submarine, hull number unknown. Propeller blade count 7, shaft rotation 112 RPM. Confidence level 94%. Chen followed protocol. She recorded the contact, transmitted an encrypted burst to the Surveillance Operations Center at Naval Ocean Systems Center in San Diego, and continued monitoring. The Delta III maintained course for 6 hours before turning southwest at 0342 local time. Chen tracked every movement. When the submarine dove to 400 meters, the towed array adjusted automatically, its hydrophones measuring the depth change through pressure-induced frequency shifts in the submarine's machinery noise. By morning, Chen had logged every detail: patrol route, speed changes, depth excursions, even a 20-minute period when the submarine hovered motionless at 340 meters, probably running a communications drill. The Delta III captain had no idea anyone was listening. He maintained standard patrol procedures, staying well outside the range where Soviet doctrine said American detection was possible. Over the next 60 days, Impeccable cataloged 17 Soviet submarines, 2 Victors, 4 Deltas, 1 Yankee, 3 Kilos on transit from Vladivostok, and 7 others whose signatures the database didn't recognize. Newer boats, probably a Kula class, that hadn't been recorded before. The SURTASS team logged 1,247 hours of tracking data, capturing mechanical signatures with such precision that analysts in San Diego could identify individual submarines by the unique frequency spikes in their reduction gear noise. The intelligence value was staggering. Every Soviet submarine that entered the Sea of Okhotsk got a permanent acoustic file. Every route, every patrol pattern, every tactical procedure went into the database. When a Delta IV departed for deterrent patrol in April, Impeccable tracked her from the moment she cleared Rybachi Naval Base until she reached deep Pacific water 2,400 kilometers away. The entire transit took 196 hours. American forces knew her position for every single one. By summer 1985, 5 more SURTASS ships had joined Impeccable: USNS Victorious, Capable, Indomitable, Assertive, and Bold. Together, they created an acoustic surveillance net across the Pacific. Victorious monitored the Kuril Island passages. Capable covered the approaches to Petropavlovsk. The others rotated through the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and the waters off Guam, where Soviet submarines transited to reach the Indian Ocean. The system worked with mechanical efficiency. Soviet submarines followed predictable routes between bases and patrol areas. SURTASS ships positioned themselves along those routes and listened. Every contact got logged, analyzed, and added to the master database that grew larger every month. By December 1985, the Naval Ocean Surveillance Information System contained acoustic profiles for 127 individual Soviet submarines, nearly 60% of their entire fleet. Moscow had no idea the Americans were building a permanent acoustic file on every boat they owned. Soviet submariners still believed their anechoic tiles and quiet machinery made them invisible beyond 30 kilometers. They operated with confidence in water that had become completely transparent. The commendations started arriving in late 1985, and nobody quite knew what to do with them. The Navy wanted to recognize Impeccable's achievements, but the ship's operations were classified 3 levels above top secret. Captain Harrington and his civilian crew couldn't be told why they were receiving awards. They just knew the senior officers kept showing up with medals and no explanations. The first was a meritorious unit commendation in November 1985 for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding service during the period March through September 1985. The citation was intentionally vague. It mentioned collection of strategic intelligence critical to national security, but gave no details about what intelligence or how it was collected. Harrington accepted the award on behalf of his crew during a quiet ceremony at Naval Base San Diego, attended by 47 people, most of whom had security clearances that prevented them from discussing what they'd witnessed. The citations kept coming. Battle Efficiency E awards in 1986, 1987, and 1988, recognition typically reserved for warships that demonstrated superior combat readiness. Navy Expeditionary Medals for deployments to the Western Pacific. The Navy Unit Commendation in June 1987 for outstanding performance during extended surveillance operations, resulting in the collection of intelligence vital to strategic deterrence planning. By 1989, Impeccable had accumulated more official commendations than most guided missile destroyers. A civilian-crewed ship with no weapons, no combat systems, and a maximum speed of 13 knots had become one of the most decorated vessels in the fleet. The irony wasn't lost on the SURTASS operators. Petty Officer Chen, promoted to chief by 1988, spent her days tracking submarines that would never know she existed. She'd logged over 8,000 hours of surveillance data, identified 234 individual contacts, and contributed to intelligence reports that reached the National Security Council. Her work was briefed to the president. She couldn't tell her parents what she did for a living. The civilian crew experienced an even stranger disconnect. Chief Engineer Robert Mills maintained engines and generators that powered systems he wasn't cleared to understand. He knew the ship towed something. The massive stern winches and cable handling gear made that obvious. He knew it had to do with underwater listening. The SURTASS spaces were clearly full of acoustic processing equipment. But the actual capabilities, the detection ranges, the strategic impact, all classified beyond his access level. Mills and the civilian mariners received hazard pay bonuses that suggested their work was dangerous, though they never encountered hostile action. They got diplomatic credentials for operations in international waters near Soviet territory. They participated in port calls where shore leave was restricted and conversations with locals were prohibited. The Navy treated them like intelligence operatives while maintaining the legal fiction that they were ordinary merchant seamen operating an oceanographic research vessel. The decorations created administrative headaches. Civilian mariners couldn't wear Navy medals. The awards went into personnel files they weren't allowed to read. When Harrington retired in 1989 after 4 years commanding Impeccable, his discharge papers listed his position as Master Ocean Surveillance Ship, with a commendation record that would have qualified him for immediate promotion to Rear Admiral if he'd been a commissioned officer. He spent his retirement in Seattle, never discussing what his ship actually did. The meritorious unit commendation hung in his study. Visitors who asked about it got the official answer: ocean surveillance work, mostly classified. What he never told them: his ship had helped win the Cold War without firing a shot. The Soviet response came in stages, each more desperate than the last. By late 1986, naval intelligence in Moscow had accepted the reality Captain Kuryadov first documented. American acoustic surveillance had achieved capabilities Soviet doctrine considered impossible. Admiral Chernavin ordered an emergency modernization program with a budget that eventually consumed 47 billion rubles, roughly $68 billion at official exchange rates. The first priority was noise reduction. The Rubin Central Design Bureau, responsible for submarine development, received orders to redesign every active class. Chief designer Igor Baranov's team focused on the 3 primary noise sources Petrov had identified: machinery, propellers, and flow noise from water moving over the hull. They attacked machinery noise by mounting every rotating component on sophisticated isolation systems. New rubber compounds with embedded damping elements replaced simple steel mounts. Coolant pumps got redesigned with magnetic bearings that eliminated metal-on-metal contact. Even electrical generators were rebuilt to operate at variable frequencies that wouldn't create consistent acoustic signatures. The modifications added 185 tons to submarine displacement and cost an average of 23 million rubles per boat. Propeller redesign took longer. Soviet engineers had been using 7-blade props optimized for thrust efficiency. American intelligence, from propeller fragments recovered by deep-sea salvage operations, showed that odd blade counts created harmonic interference patterns that were easier to detect. Baranov's team developed new 5-blade propellers with scimitar profiles that reduced cavitation noise by 60%. Manufacturing them required machine tools with tolerances Soviet factories couldn't achieve. The tooling alone cost 340 million rubles and took 18 months to procure from Japan through shell companies. The third fix, anechoic hull coatings, proved most frustrating. Soviet engineers had been coating submarines with sound-absorbing tiles since 1978. The tiles worked against active sonar, absorbing ping energy and reducing return signatures. But they did almost nothing against passive listening. Petrov's analysis showed why. The tiles dampened external sound waves but couldn't contain the noise radiating from inside the hull. A new coating went into development, multi-layer rubber compounds with precisely calculated void patterns that trapped sound trying to escape the pressure hull. The first test installation on an Akula-class boat in March 1987 reduced radiated noise by 12 decibels. Significant, but not enough. American SURTASS arrays were sensitive enough that even the improved boats remained detectable beyond 100 kilometers. By 1988, Soviet admirals faced an uncomfortable truth. They couldn't engineer their way out of the acoustic surveillance problem. American hydrophone technology had advanced too far. The only solution was operational: avoid areas where SURTASS ships operated. That meant abandoning most of the Pacific. Soviet naval intelligence had identified 6 American surveillance ships operating on rotating patrols. They covered the Sea of Okhotsk, the Kuril passages, approaches to Petropavlovsk, and the deep water transit routes to the Indian Ocean. Submarines could still deploy, but they had to assume they were being tracked from the moment they left port. The strategic implications cascaded through Soviet naval planning. Ballistic missile submarines, the cornerstone of the USSR's nuclear deterrent, lost their most valuable attribute: invisibility. American attack submarines could now be vectored onto Soviet boomers with precise coordinates. The entire second strike capability that justified 200 billion rubles in submarine construction was compromised. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov summarized the situation in a classified briefing to the Politburo in November 1988. The Americans have achieved total acoustic transparency in our primary operating areas. Our submarines operate under the assumption of continuous surveillance. Impeccable and her sister ships had done what no weapon system could. They'd made the ocean itself betray Soviet submarines. The Cold War ended not with missiles but with mathematics. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, Soviet military planners were still struggling with a problem that had no solution. Their submarines couldn't hide anymore. 3 decades of naval investment, 200 billion rubles in construction costs, and an entire strategic doctrine built around underwater stealth had been rendered obsolete by unarmed ships that just listened. The final accounting was brutal. Between 1985 and 1991, SURTASS ships conducted 847 surveillance patrols across the Pacific and Atlantic. They logged 2.4 million hours of acoustic data. The Naval Ocean Surveillance Information System contained detailed acoustic profiles for 412 individual Soviet submarines, nearly every boat in the fleet. American intelligence knew the machinery signature of each submarine, its typical patrol routes, its maximum quiet speed, even which boats had propeller damage or misaligned shaft bearings. That information translated to strategic dominance. When Soviet Delta Force submarines deployed on deterrent patrols, American attack submarines shadowed them with coordinates provided by SURTASS tracking. When Soviet attack boats attempted to trail American carrier groups, surveillance ships detected them days before they reached intercept positions. The underwater chess game that defined Cold War naval competition had become one-sided. The Americans could see the entire board, while Soviet players operated blind. Impeccable herself completed 43 deployments between 1985 and 1991, spending 1,847 days at sea. She never fired a weapon, never engaged in combat, never even carried ammunition. Her civilian crew never faced enemy action, yet her contribution to American strategic superiority exceeded that of entire carrier battle groups. The decorations reflected that reality. By the time the Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991, Impeccable had received 7 major unit citations, 12 Operational Excellence Awards, and personal commendations for 63 crew members. The Navy's official history listed her alongside aircraft carriers and battleships in the roster of vessels that decisively influenced Cold War outcomes. The human cost appeared on the other side. Soviet submarine officers who'd spent careers perfecting silent operations discovered their expertise was worthless. Captain Volkov, who'd first encountered the ghost ship in 1984, served 3 more years before requesting transfer to surface forces. His Victor III, the boat Moscow promised was undetectable, had been tracked on 18 separate patrols. American intelligence knew more about his submarine's acoustic signature than he did. The technological gap proved unbridgeable. Even after spending 47 billion rubles on acoustic quieting programs, Soviet submarines in 1991 were still louder than American boats had been in 1975. The manufacturing precision required for true acoustic stealth, tolerance levels measured in hundredths of millimeters, material purity standards that eliminated microscopic imperfections, exceeded Soviet industrial capability. They could build submarines that dove deeper and ran faster than anything America had. They couldn't build submarines that disappeared. Impeccable continued operations after the Cold War ended, monitoring Chinese and Russian submarines through the 1990s and 2000s. She deployed to the South China Sea, the Philippine Sea, and back to the waters off Petropavlovsk, where she'd first proven the SURTASS concept. In 2009, Chinese vessels harassed her in international waters, attempting to force her away from submarine operating areas, tacit acknowledgement that even 24 years after her first deployment, she remained a threat. The most decorated ship that never fired a shot had proven the ultimate Cold War lesson. Information dominates firepower. Superior awareness beats superior weapons. And sometimes the quietest vessel on the ocean, the one that just listens, is the most dangerous of all.